Webster is next on BCTV.
Good morning. This might be the most important week in Canadian history. You know what the Liberal government is up to. Unilateral patriation of our Constitution, altered, it would seem, by the House of Commons in London, not by the House of Commons in Ottawa. Trudeau, the master of the ad-lib, at a press conference says the chances of Western separatism are nil. This is the man, and I shall be interviewing him on Wednesday morning, direct by satellite from Ottawa, who said that separatism was dead in Quebec. Since Trudeau made that statement about the chances of Western separatism are nil, you know what's happened. This morning I have two different Conservative MP views on separation. One is from Ron Huntington, MP for Capilano, who seems to be all set to chop the country in two right now. Another one is from Pat Carney, Conservative, Vancouver Centre, who talks in a worried way about the inevitability of the consequences of the Liberal acts expected in the budget and the patriation of the Constitution. It will not be a happy, laughing program. To cheer you up in the program, I've got a guy who once was on a course to become Billy Graham of the world. And he's a pretty good political observer, and he might have some sane views apart from flogging his latest book, and his name is Charles Templeton. And to cheer you further, I have a political officer from the United Nations Disarmament Centre, one Ingrid Lehmann, to whom I shall ask some questions about when doomsday will come. That's just to keep you laughing and relaxed for this non-tense week we're about to have. But we're going to start hard-nosed with Ron Huntington on his views on separatism for Western Canada, or maybe it's BC alone. We'll find out from Ron after the break.
That's Hitler, that's what it is. This line must be drawn now. This is Germany.
No panic. 10 seconds only. Oh, for Christ's sake. Bye. That's the kind of call I needed. A minute past 9.
Again.
Would you like to try to use that clip again, sir?
Forget it. Ron Huntington has always been an outspoken right-wing member of the Conservative Party. Would you accept that definition?
No.
You wouldn't?
No.
Did you or did you not say that perhaps the only thing for us to do now is to separate in the 4 Western provinces because of the Liberal government's actions?
No, I did not.
What did you say?
I said it's time for the 4 Western provinces to get together in a Western Parliament from which they can deal as a bloc with the power centres of Ontario and Quebec if we're going to keep the Canadian Federation together. We cannot continue to survive in the West if we keep ourselves divided in 4 and divided in half again through the socialist market enterprise orientation of the politics of Western Canada.
How do you plan a Western Parliament of the 4 Western provinces without rupturing the entire country?
Well, I think the country's rupturing itself under its present leader, Jack, and we in the West are going to be a colony in perpetuity if we allow Mr. Trudeau and the politics of Ontario and Quebec to deliver us into an egalitarian socialist state.
Forget the egalitarian socialist state for the moment. Surely your scenario, and you're saying quite bluntly, that you want a Western Parliament of 4 Western provinces.
I don't think we have any bargaining power at all unless the 4 Western provinces group up and match the power of Ontario and match the power of Quebec in a Canadian federation.
How does the Huntington plan work? How would you take these 4 Western parliaments and put them together without separating from the rest of the country?
I think you can elect a parliament, a House of Commons or a Western House of Commons on a rep by pop basis. And I think if there's going to be a parliament, there has to be an upper house, and that should be probably half elected, and the other half should be appointees of the 4 provinces.
Have you thought this out, Mr. Huntington, or are you merely going off the top of your head? You say a Western parliament rep by pop. What would happen to the provincial legislatures?
Well, I think you still need that second level of government if you're going to protect freedoms and protect the people against a unitary form of government.
I'll get to reasons for your discontent in a moment or two, but what you're saying is that we should cut ourselves off from the rest of Canada and set up a Western parliament
And deal ourselves
with
back in.
suzerainty over the 4 Western provinces.
And deal ourselves back in.
And this Western parliament would cut itself off from Ottawa, Quebec, Ontario, and the east.
Or take another vehicle of collectivizing the political power of the West to match the political power of Ontario.
No, but be specific. When you urge a Western parliament, Ron, and I'm not trying to harry you, I'm just trying to understand, how can you do that without separating from the rest of the country?
I think you will have to, Jack.
Well, do
Or,
you have to what?
when I gave that speech,
You
I
have to
gave
what?
2 alternatives, Jack. I said either a Western Parliament or we sit as a Western caucus in the House of Commons.
Well, you sit as a Western caucus now in the House of
We
Commons.
do not.
Oh, not since the NDP defected.
No, the NDP is split. You've got the NDP split exactly the same as the Tory caucus is split.
Do you think separation is inevitable right now as a practical matter?
I don't see Canada continuing in its present state and unrest, and I, as a citizen of the West, don't see myself going without some strong thoughts and some strong words to protect the integrity of the West with what's happening to us right now.
Okay, right now we've got the unilateral patriation by Mr. Trudeau, right?
Yes.
And will he bring that in regardless?
I think it looks as if he's going to, and he certainly has the only power that can make an address to the House of Westminster.
Would you sit in the House of Commons under a unilaterally patriated constitution done by Trudeau with NDP support?
I won't sit in the House. I'll sit in the House of Commons, but I'll certainly be fighting and screaming for my part of this country.
Is it just sheer political bile that's got you, Ron? I mean, because what you're suggesting is that we chop the country in 2.
Jack, I'm not suggesting that. I'm suggesting that the country, we in the West, cannot have a fair shake in this country if we don't do something to offset Trudeau's attitude that we aren't going to separate, we have no bargaining power. Therefore, why pay any attention to the West? And what they're doing is they're emasculating the provincial powers. He's delivering more and more power into the federal state, so that they're going to be dictating to us just what everything will be. They'll be taking power and revenue away from the Western provinces. They're taking powers away from our power over resources. And what are we going to be? We're going to be dictated to by the people of Ontario, the urban centers of Ontario, and the political base of Quebec. And I don't think we in the West should even think of standing for it.
When you say not even think of standing for it, the scenario is written. Closure has been used. Closure will probably be used again after the committee report, right? What's your scenario? What are you going to do? If you just say this and then go back and nag in the House of Commons, you won't achieve your object, will you?
No, I won't. So I'm going to have to make some strong speeches out here. I don't see us split in 4 provinces, split in 2 with the political ideologies, fractured into 8 pieces, being able to stand up to the political power of urban Ontario and the French power of Quebec in the House of Commons.
Forgive my naive questions, but are you planning a separate Western Parliament party, a separatist movement?
I'm not planning anything. I'm just standing up and saying there's got to be an avenue whereby we can group up ourselves in the West to match the political power that's taking us apart. And if we can do it with a Western Parliament, and from that Western Parliament become a part of the whole again, so be it.
How can you form a Western Parliament under the Constitution, whatever it is?
Well, Jack,
unless it's an informal meeting of 4 First Ministers from the West.
Well, that's right. It'd have to be at that level.
But are you now dedicated to a separate Western Parliament?
Jack, I'm not dedicated to anything in what I said last week. I said I think it's time for us to group the power of the West up into either a Western Parliament or that we sit as a bloc in the House of Commons.
How can you do that when the NDP have sold out to Liberals already?
Then the NDP and the Conservatives should have their debate in some kind of a forum, even if it's in the Hotel Vancouver or in Winnipeg. We should have our debate, and we should find out what's best for the West.
I think you're going to break from the Tory party on this, will you?
Well, I don't know, Jack. I haven't been down in Ottawa since the session reconvened.
Would you have joined Wenman and company in front of the Deputy Speaker, shouting totalitarianism and fascism and whatnot?
I try to keep my emotions under control, but I've been down there 6 years now, and I think I would have been as angry as anybody was down there.
Tell me in a couple of sentences your basic political fear about the direction of the country under Trudeau.
Well,
Egalitarian socialism.
Well, I think he's moving us to a unitary state. I think he's emasculating the provincial powers, which I think have a safety valve in this form of government. You just have to look at the fact that the United States has maintained its freedoms as a republic because the states down there have certain strong powers that the federal government down there hasn't taken away.
But now there's a unitary state. If any state in the Union attempted to break away, the U.S. Marshals would move in tomorrow.
Absolutely, because they've had their civil war. We haven't. Also, you have to remember that in Canada, the original founding reasons for Canada coming together no longer exist. And that's one of the dilemmas we have today.
Do you think the average Joe Canadian really worries about the original founding reasons? And don't you think the average Canadian will accept any reasonable proposition to share the wealth across the country, even if all the wealth happens to be in Alberta?
Jack, I think that situation exists. We've had equalization. There's been no complaint on equalization. There's bargaining on equalization. God, all my life I can remember wanting to share as a Canadian with provinces like the Atlantic provinces and other provinces that haven't got what Ontario and BC's had.
How do I describe you from now on?
We talked about it. We didn't have it imposed on us.
Everything's been imposed on us.
It is today.
Wasn't it imposed before on the tax rental agreements during the war?
Well,
didn't the federal government keep the powers?
During the war on a national emergency that we all agreed to and understood.
How do I describe Ron Huntington? Separatist, thinking MP from Capilano.
No, Jack, you can't say that I'm not a Canadian. I've worn the Canadian uniform and I've had the Canadian badge on my shoulder with great pride, and my sister and brother and my father and my uncles before me. I had a grandfather that surveyed the boundaries of the Northwest Territories and built railroad bridges all across this country. My grandfather was the first engineer of the BC Railroad. You can't say I'm not a Canadian. I'm the kind of Canadian that could cry when I was singing "O Canada" and "God Save the Queen." I've had that deep rock bottom emotion in me. But most of us now are having this all stripped away, and I think if we're going to keep the Canada I knew and understood together, we're not going to accept one man's definition of the style and form of government that we're going to use under, or going to live under. We're going to, as a people, decide what our style and form of government is. And it's time we move back to some bottom-up input into what the Canada of tomorrow is going to be all about. And that's what I'm talking about here. As a Western Canadian, I want some input into what the style and the form of government is going to be in Canada. And we're not going to do it the way we're going under Mr. Trudeau and the Liberal government. We're paying too much attention to political labels instead of fundamental principles and philosophies. And the Lunch Bucket Brigade in Canada don't care about that. They're more interested in the sports scores. But this is the struggle some of us are in.
So you're going to go back to Ottawa when?
I don't know yet, Jack. I'm in a lawsuit all week, this week, and I've got problems at my business here as a result of the death.
Will you tell Clark what you told me?
Clark already knows. Clark and I have been debating and arguing for some time.
Advocate of a Western Parliament, Ron Huntington. Next, a slightly different view of conservative, of possibility of separation in this country. Do you think it'll come? When?
I don't think we're going to be a very happy country the way we are, Jack.
When will separation come?
Well, you know, maybe this Machiavellian Prime Minister of ours will read the political mood. He's certainly not reading the political mood of the West. He believes his political power base is Ontario, the urban centers of Ontario. He knows he's got Quebec in his hip pocket. Maybe if my colleagues in the Conservative Party can change the mood in Ontario, he will have to do some backing
Trudeau will
off.
back down, perhaps.
He should.
And if Trudeau doesn't back down?
Well, I think then the country is coming apart at the seams.
Next, that's Ron Huntington. Next, Pat Carney, MP Vancouver Centre.
Hitler, that's what it is. This line must be drawn now. This is Germany. It's on the destruction of Parliament now. It'll be too late.
Go where it should. Maybe I can catch it.
Put it up a bit higher. That'll do. Put it up a bit higher. That's fine. It's okay now.
It's all right, Ross. Maybe if you could just, would that do up?
No, it's in again.
It just doesn't want to go that way. There, I think I've got it.
That's it. You got it. Got this.
Looks
will do it.
terrible.
Great stuff. Smash it.
There, we got it.
Can I have some goddamn? Can I have some coffee, please, Joanne? Pat Carney is the Tory MP for Vancouver Centre. I put them on separately this morning so you get the two distinct views. Do you agree with Huntington?
Well, I'm not a separatist at all. I am a Canadian. And what, to me, the tragedy which is happening is that what happened Thursday in the House of Commons and what Trudeau is doing inevitably will force the separation of the West. It will be, as I said in the House, a case of the Liberals renouncing us, not us leaving by our own free will.
What was the temper in the House? What was the scene? What's the justification for these half-dozen Tory MPs to advance on the Speaker, screaming and shouting totalitarian this and that?
I don't think that you can understand or appreciate how terrible it was in the House unless you were there. You can't conceive of how upsetting it was to turn around and see guards behind the curtains, guards on the House of Commons floor. And you can't conceive of the absolute explosive temper of people who knew that they weren't going to be able to speak. When the Liberals could have allowed us more time, you know, when they brought in closure, the Liberals had had more speakers than the official opposition. And even on the night of the closure debate, the Liberals matched the opposition man for man. So people sat there thinking, if they don't stand up, we'll be able to talk or say our piece, and they didn't. And remember that at the time they brought in closure, not one MP from the Lower Mainland, you know, 1.5 million people had had a chance to speak.
You, for instance.
I had not had a chance. Fraser, Clark, Wenman, Huntington, not one. Only 3 BC MPs had had a chance to speak to the motion. So it was explosive.
Now, this was closure on the reference of the Constitution Act to the committee.
Yes, this is out of the standing order books, the standing orders of the House, and it's Rule 33, which says that once they bring in this motion, no member shall rise to speak. And they brought it in unexpectedly, having duped the NDP into supporting their measure. And it was just terrible.
Where is the inevitability? You say it's the Liberals that will reject the opposition, not the other way around. Where is, well, you've got to, if you're going to make a case of this, somebody has to spell out succinctly what is so dreadful about bringing back the Constitution from Britain. Now, I can understand the point that Trudeau is going to ask the British House, kind of cap in hand, to make the Constitution what he wants, and it then comes back to us complete. That, I can understand, annoys a lot of people.
Right.
But if it were a good Constitution, nobody would be mad.
They wouldn't be, they might not like it, but they wouldn't be angry.
All right, what is leading to the inevitability of Western separatism?
The first point is that this country has always been in a state of sort of suspended separation anyway. If you remember Nova Scotia, the year after they brought in Confederation, immediately moved to go out. And 100 years ago, Armour de Cosmos, who was one of the people who led the British Columbia into Confederation, brought in a bill for the peaceful separation of BC. So separatism per se is part of the Canadian creative tension. But what is different is that in the Constitution that Trudeau is trying to ram down our throats, he will create 2 different classes of provinces. He will make second-class citizens of the Western provinces and first-class citizens of the Ontario and Quebec. And he has done that by a numbers game. He's done that by saying that a constitution is really a game plan. The Constitution is the way you and I and the other people decide we're going to live together. And what he's doing is to say that forevermore, Quebec and Ontario, any province which has had 25% of the population, can say no to changes. Well, Ontario now has 35% of the population. Quebec's is declining. It's now 26% and dropping. But their rights to say no to future change or to, you know, set the rules for future change will be enshrined, and BC, which is only 12% of the population, will never have the chance.
All right, let me see if I've got this correctly, because I'll be interviewing Trudeau on Wednesday morning, God help me. After 2 years, when his constitution
Right.
comes back,
Right.
and after 2 years of deadlock, which will happen with the provinces, he then has the right to go to a referendum directly to the people all across the country. He decides the question, he spends the money, he takes the vote on the referendum. Am I right so far?
That's one of the measures, yes.
One of the measures. Now, as a Quebec, which is now down to 26%, even if it went to 10% of the population, would still have a permanent veto on change.
Permanent veto.
Ontario separately, if it went down from 35 to 24%, would still have a permanent veto on change.
Right.
No matter how large the population grows in Western
Right.
Canada, BC and Alberta, Saskatchewan and Manitoba, he just needs 50% of the total Western population to okay the change. Is that right?
I don't even think he needs 50% of that in the referendum. His Victoria formula requires approval by 80% of the people. And since Ontario has 35%, Ontario always gets a veto. But essentially, you're right. It's a permanent veto for Quebec, no matter what happens.
No matter how much the population might surge up in the
We
West.
could become, we could become the richest, most populated, most powerful region of the country, and Quebec and Ontario still will have a stranglehold. And the analogy that I use is think of it as say, the NHL, where, Vancouver were the Stanley Cup champions, but found that the rules were always set by the Toronto and always set by Montreal, even if they were Bush League, always. And that's why I say separatism is inevitable, because I don't know any British Columbians, when they realize that, when they understand that Trudeau is taking a constitution where we are equal, and the provinces are equal, and there is a division of powers.
Any one province at the moment has a veto.
Province. Everyone, yes, it has. And they have to reach a consensus. And they did reach a consensus. The consensus was, of course, the Vancouver consensus.
Yeah, but that's not involved in the referendum provisions. It's a Victoria consensus, is
Right.
it not, in the referendum
Right.
provision? Well, let's cool it a little bit, because after all, you're at the heart of the matter as a Tory MP. The average guy in the street thinks, geez, oh, Alberta really has all this oil in the ground. It's right that prices be equalized across the country. Do you really think that the average BC person is very much worried about Alberta's heritage fund?
No, I don't think so, except when it affects them. And that's why I say that I think this move will be inevitable. At
But
some
we
point,
import oil from Alberta. We have it subsidized in effect out of the federal treasury.
if you said, no, we don't, we're not subsidized,
We get 46 million gallons a year of Alberta oil into BC.
well, I think a lot of people in BC would feel that Alberta has a right to more than just 50% of world prices for oil. Think of it in BC in terms of our timber. Supposing in BC we were told by the rest of the country that we could only get for our timber resource 50% of world prices,
We'd rebel.
and we'd rebel. So is it so unreasonable when Alberta is constantly told, that's what you have, energy, and you only get 50% of world prices? What would happen in Ontario if you told people they only got 50% of the price of gold, of world market price for gold? They'd rebel. If you told the people of Quebec that they got less than market for their hydroelectric power, they would rebel.
Next step, therefore, in your scenario, I couldn't pin Huntington down on his scenario. Have you got a scenario for the growth of physical separation in the West? You say if Trudeau keeps on the way he's going, that it's inevitable. What is your scenario? I hate to deal hypothetically, but I must.
I would hope that it would never get to that despair. I would hope, as I say, that in the 100 years of the Confederation, whenever we've gone this far, the Ontario and Quebec and the Liberal Party has stopped and has altered its route. And the example I use is in the construction of the railway. But you all remember that when BC entered Confederation, it was on the grounds that they build the Transcontinental Railway. In actual fact, after the Liberal government got in again, they decided not to build the railway and only offered $750,000, a mere $750,000 in lieu of building it. And there was an uproar in the province, and they sent out Lord Dufferin, and they gave in. And I'm hoping that this government, you know, when it is faced with the fact that they are destroying the country, will back off it. And we have to help them do that by making sure that everyone understands that we'll never accept it. We'll
by
never
crying
accept
wolf about physical separation?
I just think we have to say never, ever.
Hold your breath. I'm going to bring Huntington back for a minute, if you don't mind, and I'm going to take a gamble this morning. I'm going to chance some telephone calls on this to see if anyone understands what we have been, and I'm not insulting you, you know what I mean, talking about. I'd like some short, sharp, succinct calls as to whether or not you agree. I don't like to do separation polls, you know what I mean?
No.
If you understand the issues as outlined by Carney, after the break. I don't want to stress the difference in views, but there is a considerable difference in views between Mrs. Carney and Mrs. Huntington, right?
No.
I don't think so.
What?
You're trying to create cleavage out of semantics, Jack, and you know it.
We have different approaches to the issue, but we're in basic agreement that if this Constitution goes through as amended, as they're trying to do now, this country will be in deep difficulty and the West will inevitably go its way. That's what we agree on.
We've both said that the Liberal position, the Trudeau position, has to back off or separation is inevitable.
Go ahead, please.
Yes, I understand what they're talking about. I feel sorry for the poor little people that write into the paper and say, oh, I'm a Canadian, my country first, and they don't have a clue that their country isn't going to be the country they've been used to at all.
No, that's
and one
correct.
other thing, anybody in this province who again votes NDP has got to have their head examined, because Mr. Broadbent has sold not only BC and Alberta down the river, he sold the whole country down the river. And I'm sure Mr. Huntington understands what we're talking about.
Briefly.
Well, briefly, I agree with her. I think the game plan here is a very serious game plan, and Broadbent isn't going to fight Trudeau because it's a vehicle to socialize Canada.
Broadbent won very little concessions. As a matter of fact, all he won was a reaffirmation of what we already have, and for that he will give BC second-class status.
Go ahead, please.
I agree with both of your guests. I agree with the previous caller. I don't see a difference in their points of view. I think they are articulating the problems that we in Canada are facing beautifully.
Thank you, ma'am. Go ahead, please.
It's Margaret Mitchell from MP for Vancouver East.
NDP MP for Vancouver East.
And I must say I quite object to the statements and misrepresentation that these two members are giving today. I think, Jack, that this is really just sour grapes on the part of the Conservatives. They've had no constructive suggestions whatsoever in the House of Commons on what we believe is a nonpartisan issue.
Pat Carney.
Margaret, I often, I wonder how you sleep nights when you say things like that. We have brought in the Vancouver Consensus, which treats all provinces equally. We brought in a motion this week in the House simply to repaint the Constitution and change it here, and you voted against that. We have brought in very constructive changes, and Joe Clark has been the only leader who's gone to the country and said, look, this is a Trojan horse. It has got more problems than we can believe. And your party and you as an MP voted with Trudeau on a measure that will enshrine second-class rights for British Columbians. And don't tell me that that's gobbledygook, because that's true.
Jack, I think that Pat, with all due respect, is really misrepresenting the situation entirely. The Conservatives were quite petulant. I watched them. I sat beside them.
Never mind the petulance. Let's get back to this point of the referendum, which I am assured by all authorities gives Ontario and Quebec a veto on changes in the Constitution for time immemorial ahead.
We still have some...
Is that right, Margaret? Is that correct?
At the present time, we have some... about that, Jack, and it's going to...
Why didn't you make that part of the deal instead of just the resources thing?
Well, because we felt that at this point in time, the resources was the most important, and if it hadn't been enshrined, everything that the...
You mean it got Saskatchewan off the hook?
Right.
It got Saskatchewan off the hook on the potash.
We already
When
have.
they've been looking after BC and Alberta, and that's what these members...
Margaret, you'll have your say on the program one of these mornings as the fight develops, and I shall give you a call. Much obliged.
I just want to
a
point
full
out,
opinion on it, eh?
you're just right on that, is that the measure that the NDP won on interprovincial trade does help Saskatchewan. It means nothing for BC. And the fact is, we already own our resources. And a letter between Mr. Trudeau and Mr. Broadbent confirming that we own we have the right to manage our resources. That letter did not say that we own it. It said only that we have the right to manage, is giving us less than what we already have.
From where is this call? Haney, go ahead, please.
Hello. I am 100% beside for these two callers. I think we're being pushed into separation by this man. I'm
Good.
for you 100%, Mr. Huntington and Pat Carney.
Thank you. Go ahead,
you.
please.
Well, I totally oppose their viewpoint, and I think that they should be tried for treason. I think all this kind of talk is treasonous. I'm
Why?
Canadian, and Mrs. Carney, you talk too much. You wouldn't even let Mrs. Mitchell talk.
Mrs.
And
Mitchell
I wish
has-
you'd give somebody else a chance. You want to hear what the people have to say, well, then just give me a minute.
Mrs. Mitchell said that we had nothing constructive to offer, and I corrected her on that.
I'd like to
And when
correct-
you say that we should be booked for treason, I would like to ask you, have you ever read the BNA Act? And have you read the new declaration that Mr. Trudeau has brought in? Have you, just answer yes or no, have you read it?
I have, and Mrs. Carney, you spoke something that was not so. You said that the NDP sold out. The Liberals had enough votes without any NDP member.
Oh, yeah, they had enough votes, but it makes it look a hell of a lot better if they can get the NDP to back them on the constitutional package.
Right, and you cannot deny that the amendments that are being brought in by Mr. Trudeau give a second-class status to BC.
I don't agree with you at all, and I do think the only thing I don't like about the whole thing is the veto, and I'm going to write to Mr. Trudeau and tell him I don't like that veto for Ontario and Quebec.
Thank
But
you.
you agree with me that there is a veto for Ontario and Quebec, and that's my point.
Go ahead, please.
Yes, I'm one very concerned, very angry Westerner who agrees 100% with these two fine, upstanding MPs. And I'll add another thing. The Soviet Union has a wonderful Bill of Rights, but it does not, I repeat, does not guarantee freedoms in reality.
Thank you. Go ahead, please.
I just want to tell Mr. Huntington and Pat Carney that as a Liberal, they're both 100% right. We now have three socialists in Ottawa. We have Mr. Broadbent, Mr. Trudeau, and our Governor General.
Thank you very much, sir. Another plug for, what's his name again? The Governor General?
Ed Schreier.
Ed Schreier. Go ahead from Victoria.
Yes, I have been a Westerner transposed to the East for 28 years, and now I'm back, and heaven help me. And I'm just so grateful that we have two aspiring people with you now that are fully behind the things that they are stating. And I think that most good thinking people today in our country should see the light in time, I hope.
Thank you.
Jack, I'd like to thank that caller, and I want to point out that Ron and I are doing what you pay us to do. We're doing what you pay us to do. We go to Ottawa, we take a look at the legislation, and we say, no, stop. This is not in our interest or the interest of our constituents. So we appreciate the nice things you say about us, but we're doing our job. And it was because closure was brought in and meant that other MPs couldn't do theirs that made people so inflamed.
How many more times can closure be invoked?
One more time, anyway.
One more time on the report stage as
When
the
it comes
resolution
back.
comes back from committee.
Now, it's a committee of the House and the Senate, isn't it?
That's a committee of the House and the Senate, and I'll have to ask Pat if the structure of that committee vis-a-vis the different parties in the House has been agreed to yet.
No, there's been no word or agreement on how the committee will be
Now,
structured,
is
and
that-
some speculation that there will be only one-day debate on the report when it's
Are
brought
you
back.
telling me that that's got to be back in by December 9?
In theory, it is supposed to be back by December 9, but it, as you know, has gone to the Senate, and the Senate has no provision for closure. And the Conservative senators are probably prepared to
Well, the object of
discuss
your
it.
exercise will be to foul up Trudeau's announced date for total repatriation by the British House of Commons by July the 1st next year.
No, it's not quite that simple. Our aim is to ensure that this measure, which disenfranchises British Columbians, does not go ahead on any date, any time, anyhow.
Ron Huntington, Pat Carney, thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'm going to have fun on Wednesday morning. Wednesday morning, I'm going to be interviewing by satellite Lalonde, McKechnie, the Prime Minister, hopefully Joe Clark,
Oh, get on. Can you get on the phone?
at least John Crosby, the morning after the budget.
What about John Chrétien?
Chrétien? No, I've got my choices, McKechnie, Lalonde, and Trudeau.
Okay.
Chrétien will be here in November, but by that time, who knows what the
Who knows
situation will
what
be
will
in the
be.
country. I just hope you're not whipping up a maelstrom.
Well, do you think, if that is the result, can you blame us for
No.
saying we will not accept second-class
No.
status? I mean,
No.
who are you going to lay the blame on?
And
We're the
Jack-
ones saying we don't want it to happen. We don't want.
It's just that I hate to sit here and sound myself like an advocate for splitting up the bleeding country.
No.
Well, Jack, you've got to, there comes a time in Western Canada on this issue when we've got to stop absorbing. The old British quality of absorbing and absorbing and appeasing has come to an end. The hour is close.
And we haven't even talked about the Bill of Rights?
No, but you know, up till now in Western Canada, we've accepted the discrimination and costs. It costs more to live here than in Ottawa. We've accepted an awful lot of discriminatory measures, but we don't think
I think that's as much
it.
as I can digest this morning. But I'm grateful both to Messrs. Huntington and Carney. When do you go back to Ottawa?
Today.
When do you go back? Oh, you're stuck in court on a lawsuit. After the break. Oh, next we're going to have an Eastern observation or two from a guy who used to be a first-class newspaper man. Don't know what he is now. We'll find out. Charles Templeton. After the break.
That you nailed Margaret.
Sure.
Jesus, they can't answer.
No.
Thank you. It's one mic, Ross.
Charles Templeton, I suppose, was an old colleague of mine at one time. Newspaper man, broadcaster, television star, one of the early big names on CBC. Popped in this morning to sell a book. Before you sell a book, Charles, it's probably the first time you've had such outspoken opinions on the inevitability of separation from a sober person like Carney. How does it make you, as a dedicated Easterner, feel?
Well, I'm not a dedicated Easterner. I think what Carney, and not so much what Huntington, but what Carney is saying is so. I think that we have a Prime Minister whose principal concern is to achieve what he has set for himself as personal life goals that will mark his name in history as the man who brought back the Constitution, but in addition to that, who set up a Bill of Rights, after which he's probably going to go off to the United Nations and let us fend for ourselves. I do not think you have begun to see the noise that's going to be raised in the West and elsewhere when the budget comes in. And we find as a result of that budget that they're going to tax the export of natural gas. And you're going to read that not only as something touching Alberta, but you're going to read it as something that will touch BC as well.
Very much so.
Jack, I do not believe the scope or the virulence or the problems that is going to be seen. I think today was patty cake to what you're going to see. I really do.
I don't know how to handle it.
Well, first of all, you can't handle it, nor neither can I, except by talking about it.
I'm talking about handling the talking about it.
Yeah.
I, of course, have a resentment about this Bill of Rights for some very strange reasons.
Well,
I don't like this idea of a codified Bill of Rights which will amend and change our criminal code and put in all kinds of freedoms which we may lose when we've got every freedom there is at the moment which can't be taken away from us.
Well, not only that, but what in the world good is it going to do to entrench some Bill of Rights? The Americans have had a Bill of Rights almost coincident with the forming of their Constitution. And what has happened? You had Jim Crow laws for almost 150 years. You had all kinds of things happening in that country. You talk about the War Measures Act, for instance, that we may not have it if we have a Bill of Rights. Let me remind you of Kent State. Let me remind you of the fact that in the South, when two blacks tried to go into a university, they were blocked at the door by the governor. It is an illusion that if you entrench something, it therefore is going to guard you in perpetuity.
It's a temper of the day that causes governments to act. And we'd have the War Measures Act again tomorrow if there were a national emergency.
You would if you had, as Prime Minister of the country, Pierre Trudeau, and he thought that under the set of circumstances not investigated at the time that it was necessary to do what he did.
But you must admit Trudeau is clever. He's got the NDP in his pocket for the passing of the Act. He's got the Davis government, the Conservative government in Ontario in his pocket. And is there any storm in Ontario about the injustice potentially to the West under this?
Well, see, what this country has never bought and never understood is that you cannot have a country in which you have such separate regions as we have. They are geographic regions. The Maritimes are separate from Quebec not only by some bad land, but by language. Quebec is separate from Ontario by language. Ontario from the west by the Precambrian Shield, the west, much of it, from British Columbia by the mountains. Now, we all grow up living regionally rather than federally.
What should he have done? Just brought the Constitution, Trudeau, brought it back as is?
What he should have done is looked after some of the real problems of this country, which are in the nature of a budget where we'll have a deficit of about $16 billion this year. He should have done something about unemployment. He should have done something about the whole economic mess. We should face the fact, as Canadians, you cannot take from the provinces such a thing as oil from Alberta at approximately half the world price and expect them to sit still and like it. We are the last Western industrial country to bite the bullet, because Mr. Trudeau, rather than tell us the bad news, is prepared to raise taxes or to lift deficits.
He's going on the premise that the promise to Quebec made in the referendum is more important than anything else.
Okay. Well,
is that right?
Well, yes, but was that the promise made to Quebec? I don't remember what he is now seeking to do as being the promise made to Quebec. He said there would be changes made that would secure their positions and their attitudes. But supposing the separatism here, are you then going to get the same kind of thing
Promises
Quebec
made
got?
to us.
Promises made to you?
I think one of the biggest mistakes he made was in saying that the chances of Western separatism are nil, because even among non-separatists, it raises the hackles on the back of your head.
Yeah, but what's being forgotten in all of this is that the nature of Canada is in the midst of drastic and radical change. The whole power base that used to be out east is not going to be there in the future. And unless you realize that unless you have a division of powers in this country that is recognized, that the provinces have rights and the federal government has rights, and you cannot trample on one of them.
Fair enough. Let's do business on your books. Do you think we could take a change from this thing? Let's try and lighten it.
Yeah. Well,
Charles Templeton has written a book called The Third Temptation. It's about an evangelist. He's a bit sleazy. The $500, $600, $700 suit evangelist type. And the first time I met Charles Templeton, he was the smoothest, most sincere evangelist in the whole wide world. Wasn't you, Charles? How many years ago is that?
I left the ministry in 1957.
That's 23
years ago.
You were then, you were an evangelist.
See what an impression I made on you,
It was
Jack?
before then, because you were then evangelizing.
Yes, but it was about 1955 when I saw you. Matter of fact, you and I had at it for about half an hour.
My first question to you in my gauche, abrupt, brusque manner, which has long since vanished, was, how much money do you make?
Yeah, and I told you,
you
$150 a week, nothing else.
And then I said to you, what about all your expenses?
Yeah, my expenses when I was traveling, nothing else. Never saw the money. You know that, Jack. Now, don't bring that up at this late hour.
No, I'm only being nostalgic. Yeah. Because since after that came to know you as the editor, wasn't you? The managing editor of the Toronto Star?
Director of News and Public Affairs, CTV, editor of Maclean's magazine. Yeah, you name it, I did it.
Talents. How old are you, Charles?
65.
Don't look a day more than 55.
True.
Is that your own hair color?
Yes.
No kidding.
Can't even take it off to go to bed.
No, is it your own color?
Oh, yeah, look at it. It's gray.
Beautifully done.
You like it, Jack?
I have to touch mine with Clairol. The Third Temptation. That's a lie, by the way. I don't.
No, I know. Jack, let me tell what the basic book is about, because you haven't done it. You're
going to do it after the break.
Okay.
I know how to annoy old friends. I'll ask Charles Templeton to tell me if The Third Temptation is at least partly autobiographical and to give me the shot on it.
The answer is yes. Can I tell you what the book's about?
Yeah.
Okay. The book is about an evangelist, as big as Billy Graham, but nothing to do with Billy Graham. World-class evangelist, stays at the White House, eats at Buckingham Palace, married to a former Miss America. At the height of his power, millions of followers, $80 million a year business, television contracts. At the height of his power, he loses his faith. But he's too big to quit. I mean, can you imagine Billy Graham coming on television, holding up his Bible and say, I now reject this, I don't believe anymore? No. A newspaper publisher, the head of a chain of newspapers, learns about it inadvertently and sets a group of investigative reporters to tracking him down to try and find something in the background of his life. Warts and all are the instructions. The climax of the book, to finish it, is in the CNE Stadium with 50,000 people present. The papers are on the street, the expose is in the hands of the people sitting in the stand. He walks in having lost his faith to deal with the situation. I won't tell you, of course, what happens.
No. Has it happened?
Did I lose my faith?
No.
Yes. Oh, yes.
Oh, you lost your faith?
Oh, sure. You knew that.
Oh, I thought you said just a moment ago, no, you gave me an indication that you're still a born-again Christian.
No, no, no. I said I haven't changed. I'm no longer a Christian, but I haven't changed. I'm an agnostic. You know that, Jack.
How can you sit there and say you're no longer a Christian?
Easily.
I couldn't say that if you paid me to.
Yes, but
And I'm not necessarily a Christian.
Well, I didn't think you were the way you go on sometimes.
No, I'm an ordinary, reasonable human being who knows that death is permanent, have doubts about my mortality, about my immortality.
Don't we all?
Don't we all?
Yeah. Jack, I'm an agnostic for the simple reason that slowly, over a period of time, I came to the place where I could no longer believe the things you must believe to be a Christian. So there's one of two things to do: stay in or get out. I got out. Jimmy Coulter stayed in. And the end result of that were all kinds of problems in his life.
Mind you, blind faith is a great thing to have no matter the cause.
Yes, if you're blind.
No, if you can adopt the mask of faith.
No, you see, I disagree with that. Jesus said, among other things, thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy mind. Mm-hmm. Therefore, that you are required to think. Not to think is a kind of dying. Mm-hmm. If you don't think, you begin to die. I think you must think about your faith. Blind faith is not a good thing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Can't think of anything to say to you.
Well, then I'll talk.
You talk.
Okay. Is the book autobiographical? Well, it starts in Regina. It goes to Toronto. Jimmy Coulter lives through the Depression, didn't I? Jimmy Coulter gets a job on a newspaper.
You didn't start in Regina, did you?
I lived in Regina, yes.
You're a prairie boy.
I'm a prairie boy for all my early 12 years.
Oh, yeah, Jimmy Coulter gets a job
in the sports department of the newspaper, thinly disguised as the old Globe where I worked. He becomes converted. He becomes an evangelist. All of it true of me, but it's not me.
No.
Matter of fact, the big problem in the book, Jack, was to get Coulter and me separate so that when he reacted, it was his reaction and not mine.
Yeah.
More than that, what it's an attempt to do is to attempt to treat for the first time, honestly, evangelists. St. Clair Lewis wrote a book about a very rascally man. I don't know anybody like him. And this tries to deal with the fact that they are human beings who fall under the same temptations.
But on
and face the
Sunday
same
mornings when it's wet at the farm and I have to watch these people on their coast-to-coast hookups, they really upset me. Place your hands on the set and be good.
Jack, I believe that television evangelism, I'm talking about television evangelism, not Billy Graham, who is really talking to a crowd and they're taking a picture of him talking to a crowd.
Does it very well.
Television evangelism, the guy who sits behind a Jack Webster type desk or a Johnny Carson type desk. I don't think that's Christian. And the reason I don't think it's Christian, in any sense of the word, is because what it's saying, it's a product of the me generation. What it's doing is it's saying, look, give your life to God, and God will look after you. He'll be your friend. He'll go with you in your problems, and He'll help you out, and He'll make you happy and successful. Give your money to us, and God will return it to you tenfold.
That's right.
Now, the thing that's wrong with that is that it's not New Testament. In the New Testament, Jesus said, take up your cross and come and follow me. Take what you have, sell it, give it to the poor, and come and follow me. The thing that sent Jesus to the cross, indeed, that's what the third temptation was here. Let me tell you what the third temptation was. Jesus was in the wilderness, and the devil came to him, as it says in the New Testament. And he took him on the top of an exceeding high mountain and said unto him, and showed him the power and the glory of that world, and said unto him, worship me, and it's all yours. In other words, you've got everything. Mm-hmm. You can have anything you want with your powers of persuasion, your personality. So do that, worship me, compromise, and it'll all be yours. Now, facing that temptation, Jesus said no and went to a cross. Facing that temptation, Jimmy Coulter didn't have the guts. He's a pretty decent guy, but he didn't have the guts. And the end result of that, of course, is what the book talks about.
I don't know. I also wanted to talk to this morning, now I haven't got time, about the failure of the media in this country to help establish national unity. The media, it would seem from here on in, is going to help to establish national disunity.
I think everybody's selling out these days. The media has sold out in the sense that it takes what people say without really looking at it, with few exceptions.
How can
the NDP has sold out, forgetting the lesson of the last time David Lewis sold out and suddenly found themselves kaput? Do you think the people in the West in the next election are going to vote NDP on the ground of what's been happening?
Lose a lot of votes, I'll tell you.
Exactly.
And neither the CBC nor the CTV has done a comprehensive job of attempting to explain one end of this country to another, or the middle to the center, or the middle to the wings. Am I correct?
Yes. By and large, there are good reporters in this country, but they're a minority. The rest, I'm afraid, tend to exist on the ground of handouts.
I'm not talking about reporters, I'm talking about networks.
Networks are reporters, Jack, the people at the top, and I was at the top of CTV. You decide what's going to be done. The other people merely do it. It's the people in charge who make the decisions.
Charles, good to see you. Glad you were here this morning. Good change of pace.
Mention the name of the book again.
Charles Templeton.
And mention that I shall be signing books down at Eaton's at noon. Be a good boy.
You sure?
Thank you, Jack.
Signing books where?
Eaton's.
In Vancouver?
In Vancouver. In Vancouver.
At noon today.
Yes, today.
Regards to Pierre Burton when you see him.
Thank you.
Nice old fellow.
Nice to see you, Jack.
Nice to see you, Charles. Next, I've got another happy one. Disarmament Week, while they're fighting in the Middle East, with a delightful person from political officer from the United Nations Disarmament Centre. After the break. Back in this goddamn chair. United Nations Disarmament Week. And when you say that, it sounds like a plug for the Red Feather or the Community Chest or something like that, but it's not really. Night after night, you watch the television news and you see the fuss and the kerfuffle about the Straits of Hormuz, on the fighting between Iraq and Iran, on the dreadful tension over the potential release of the U.S. hostages in Iran. And this is Disarmament Week, and with me is Ingrid Lehmann, who still is a special assistant to UN Secretary General Kurt Waldheim.
Well, I was for several years. Now I've changed jobs.
What
but
is your
still
role now precisely, Ingrid?
I'm a political affairs officer in the Center for Disarmament, and that's my third job with the UN. And
I saw a story in the papers the other day which was absolutely horrifying, that if there ever were, God forbid, nuclear attacks on the United States and every weapons officer was killed, that a doomsday computer would in any event retaliate. Is that the kind of scenario at which we are looking if there was in fact a nuclear holocaust?
well, we're looking at worldwide, not just from one particular country's perspective, but try to take into account all countries' interests and all people's interests, really. And that means that you try to get beyond what would happen to country X, because the assumption is that in the event of a nuclear holocaust, the disaster would be affecting practically all parts of the world.
In the UN Disarmament Centre, what do you do? Now, the last time I had any great discussion about disarmament was the SALT II Treaty. Is that signed and in effect? And is there any effective restriction of the manufacture of nuclear weapons between the big powers?
Well, part of the problem is that some of the bilateral disarmament negotiations have not been brought into the United Nations the way maybe some countries would want them to be brought into the United Nations. But that doesn't really matter so much, because we feel that it's at this stage, at this very, very dangerous stage, where $1 million are being spent a minute on arms. Right now, where we're talking every minute, $1 million US.
By all of the countries?
By all countries taken together, yes. We feel that at this stage, it's a matter for the international community as a whole. It does, of course, affect the largest military powers, first of all, in particular the nuclear powers. But the feeling is that this is becoming a worldwide phenomenon, and it's in the interest of the international community to stop it.
Now, what can the individual do, really? I mean, here we are in Canada, and what might seem to the rest of the world somewhat of a parochial crisis over constitution. You smile a little.
Well, I think it's very good that people are involved in their local and their national community problems, and I also think that people will have to look always beyond their own national boundaries.
20 years ago, you could raise a great storm on the Canadian campaign for nuclear disarmament. Now, I don't know how much of a storm will be raised now. Have people come to accept the kind of inevitability of the nuclear proliferation?
I don't think so. Since you asked me about Canada, for example, I know of events going on during Disarmament Week in 30 different places within Canada. And if I look at it worldwide, I personally know of events in
25, 30 different countries. But those are people that have approached us at the United Nations, so I think there's much more going on. My personal feeling is, after having been in this kind of a job for 6-7 months now, that there is a much more widespread fear and feeling of insecurity arising out of the arms race among many people in all the different parts of the world.
Would you say that with the situation in Iraq and Iran, that we are still on a brink of something or other?
Well, I think we are for a number of reasons, and this kind of conflict, which may seem very far to people in Vancouver, can always expand into a larger scale global conflict, and this must be kept in mind, that what happens in one seemingly distant part of the world can affect everyone else, just like that, when in particular, the two biggest powers get involved.
Well, the two big powers presumably will stand off. Does the danger come not from the two biggest powers, but from the little people who have garnered the nuclear technology? Countries such as, we'll say, for the sake of argument, let me think, India? Who has Israel is believed to have nuclear weapons, is it not?
Well, there are a number of countries, I think something like 10 to 15, it is rumored, who may or may not have the nuclear bomb. I really think that is one of the dangers, that we do not have control over the kind of trade in nuclear technology, as well as some new conventional weapons as well.
And you disarmament people get upset about nations like Canada, which sell reactors for peaceful purposes. I forget the name of our reactor, but it was believed to have been used by India in creating the bomb. Are we breaking any international laws when we sell nuclear reactors to Japan and Brazil, I think it was?
Well, from the United Nations point of view, Canada is a member of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and therefore it complies with the requirements of the treaty. What we're concerned about is really trade to countries that are not members of the international treaties that we do have, and that's part of the problem.
What treaties do we have right now? We've got the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which prevents the signatories from selling atomic knowledge or whatever to these to outside countries.
Well, it doesn't really prevent them. It has a rather complicated system of safeguards to be applied, but in some cases they're not applied to the whole of the nuclear program that a country may have that is not part of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. It's a very complex issue. I don't know if you want to get involved.
What about SALT II? Do we had SALT I, I remember. Which
right, and SALT II still needs to be ratified, and that's one of the problems, that SALT II, as you know, has not been ratified, and unless it is, the nuclear arms race between the two biggest powers can go on unchecked.
SALT II is the bilateral treaty between the Soviet Union and the United States. But surely the big nations at least have stopped the atmospheric testing. Is it just China and France that do that now?
Well, there was a, I think, 1963 treaty to ban nuclear tests in the atmosphere, underwater. But underground tests are still continuing, not just by those two countries, but the other nuclear powers as well. And that's one of the next biggest issue, that we need a comprehensive test ban, which is currently being negotiated also under United Nations auspices in Geneva. But we have not made much progress there recently, and it's up to the three biggest powers in particular. That's the US.
I'm going to ask you what the individual can do after the break. What's it like to work at the United Nations, Ingrid? You're now a political officer, liaison with non-governmental organizations, United Nations Centre for Disarmament, right?
It's pretty long, isn't it?
Isn't it? Do you feel you're achieving anything, or are you just part of a bureaucracy which routinely sends out stuff about the dangers of nuclear war?
Well, I've been pretty lucky. I've had a very varied United Nations experience. I've been out in the field. I've been in Cyprus with a peacekeeping force there. I've been in Namibia with a would-be peacekeeping force. And I've been in the Secretary General's immediate cabinet for several years.
With Waldheim?
Yes. So I think I've had a pretty varied experience. And I come out now after 5, almost 6 years saying that I think the individual can make a difference in big organizations, even big, unwieldy seeming international structures. And the nice thing in the UN is that you have people from 154 different countries working together, and it's a good testing ground of what can be done in international cooperation.
Well, now, what can the individual do watching this program this morning? Now, what can they do except cross their fingers and pray?
Well, I think use the available means in their countries, use the machinery that there is. For example, in this country there is an Office of Disarmament Advisor, which I think is a fantastic institution which only very few countries have. There is the willingness on the part of some government officials to accept the idea that people of the world have an interest in preserving peace. You know, everybody talks about we have a right to employment, we have a right to freedom of speech, but to assert the right of people to live for the generations to come rather than to go down destroyed in a nuclear holocaust.
But the individual really can only do a couple of things, right? To his MP or attend public meetings or rallies about nuclear weapons.
Well, I think, you know, the peace movement, the international peace movement has to come out of the protest stage and it has to become a legitimate movement in all countries. And I'm not just talking about this country. I have a colleague right now on Polish television and another one in Yugoslavia. You know, we're talking about a worldwide movement. I think people have to be really sure that whatever they're demanding from their government isn't going to leave them open to attack by the others.
But you say Polish and Yugoslavia. Will you have any colleagues on Russian television during Disarmament Week this year?
We will eventually, not this year. You know, we're just starting this program, an international program for disarmament information, really this year. But I think we will next year. And we will also go to some third world countries where I think there's even a greater need for objective information.
The tactical situation seems to have changed in Europe in that they're now talking about limited strike missiles for a conventional type war with nuclear weapons. Is that any aid and comfort for the ordinary person who wonders if the world will be there when they get up in the morning?
Well, not to my mind, but you know, this is a very, very tough issue. And one of the problems of the UN is we can't really involve ourselves in the domestic security questions of each individual country. We have to speak in pretty global terms, which doesn't you know, always make it very easy to appeal directly to people. But I think what people can do all over the world, and I think they're doing that, is to demand this objective information. And I think, if I may appeal to you also, the media can do more than maybe they have done in the past. And this is not meant to be as a criticism, but I think information often, especially information that comes out of the UN, is not picked up by media people because it's being considered not newsworthy.
That's right. I mean, for instance, I was reading a piece in Newsweek at the weekend, which I summarized here, about the Trident submarine. They cover the world. About the Russian submarines, they cover the world. That the Russians have more ICBMs than the United States, that the Russians spend more money, but the United States hope to survive with overkill.
Well, we now have enough nuclear weapons on Earth to kill every man, woman and child 10 times over. You know, if people argue that that is not enough, that you have to have enough weapons to kill people 100 times over, I just don't see the rationale.
But think of the industrial dislocation if somebody said stop making arms.
Well, you know, actually studies have shown in some countries where there have been conversion projects, namely some industries that have gone bankrupt or whatever, have been converted to peaceful uses.
Happened after the war, after the big Second World War.
And what this has shown is that such civilian industries create many more jobs, something like twice as many as an arms industry. And these facts also have to be known. And what the UN is doing is to try and come up with objective, factual information that we can distribute worldwide.
Okay, we'll give you a shot here.
Right.
Questions to Ingrid Lehmann, political officer, United Nations Disarmament Centre, former buddy of Waldheim's. After the break. Oh, but